Picture this. You're in a hospital bed. You're sick, but you're going to survive. The doctors say you're recovering well. Your family just left after visiting hours. You're alone. Then a nurse's aide walks in, soft-spoken, friendly smile. He asks how you're feeling, fluffs your pillow, adjusts your IV. Get some rest, he says gently. You'll feel better soon. You close your eyes, grateful for his kindness. 20 minutes later, you're dead. And he's already moved on to the next room. For 18 years, Donald Harvey walked hospital corridors. In Kentucky and Ohio, killing patients with cyanide, arsenic, rat poison, and his bare hands. He murdered at least 87 people, but confessed the real number might be over 300. He wasn't paid to do it. He wasn't avenging anyone. He did it because, in his own words, it made me feel like God. Families thanked him for comforting their loved ones as they died. They had no idea he was the reason they died. Doctors praised his dedication. Co-workers called him compassionate. Patients trusted him completely, and he used that trust to become the most prolific serial killer in American medical history. This is the story of Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in a small Kentucky town. His childhood was a nightmare of abuse and trauma. He claimed he was sexually molested by a neighbor starting at age 4, then later by an uncle and other relatives. Whether all of his abuse claims were true or exaggerated. For sympathy, one thing was undeniable. Harvey grew up obsessed with death. As a teenager, he spent hours wandering through cemeteries and funeral homes. He told people he could sense when someone was about to die. Friends found it creepy. Harvey found it thrilling. In 1970, at just 18 years old with zero medical training, Harvey got hired as a nurse's aide at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Within months, he committed his first murder. Logan Evans was a stroke patient recovering in Harvey's ward. Harvey found him annoying, too demanding, too difficult. So one night, Harvey walked into Evans' room, turned off his oxygen supply, and smothered him with a pillow. Evans was declared dead from complications related to his stroke. No autopsy, no investigation, no one suspected a thing. And that's when Donald Harvey had a terrifying realization. He could get away with murder. Over the next several months at Marymount Hospital, Harvey killed at least 12 more patients. He'd smother them with pillows, turn off their ventilators, or give them fatal overdoses of medication. Each time, the deaths were attributed to natural causes or complications from existing illnesses. Harvey later described these early killings as practice. He was learning what worked, what didn't, how much force it took to suffocate someone, how long it took them to die. He was experimenting. But in 1971, Harvey's time at Marymount came to an end. Not because anyone suspected him of murder, but because he was caught stealing from the hospital. He was fired but avoided criminal charges. His killing spree at Marymount was over, but Donald Harvey was just getting started. After bouncing between a few jobs, Harvey found his perfect hunting ground in 1975, the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. The VA hospital was massive, chronically understaffed, and filled with elderly, vulnerable patients. Harvey worked the night shift as a nurse's aide in the cardiac care unit. He had access to medication rooms, IV supplies, and most importantly, unsupervised time with patients. This is where Harvey evolved from opportunistic killer to calculating predator. He developed a system. He'd identify targets, patients he found annoying, demanding, or sometimes just random victims who happened to be on his shift. Then he'd choose his method based on convenience and what would look most natural. Sometimes he'd inject cyanide directly into their IV bags. Other times he'd use arsenic mixed into their food or medication. He'd coat their pudding or ice cream with rat poison. He'd administer fatal doses of morphine or insulin. If chemicals weren't available, he'd simply turn off their oxygen or place a wet towel over their faces until they suffocated. Harvey later admitted he enjoyed experimenting with different methods. He wanted to know which poisons worked fastest, which were hardest to detect, which caused the most suffering. But here's what makes Harvey particularly disturbing. He kept trophies. After killing someone, Harvey would often steal small, personal items, jewelry, watches, photographs, religious medals. He'd take them home like souvenirs from a vacation. When police eventually raided his apartment years later, they found boxes filled with items belonging to dozens of victims. Between 1975 and 1985, Harvey claims he killed at least 15 people at the VA hospital. But investigators who reviewed death records from that period believe the actual number could be 30 to 40 or higher. And through it all, no one suspected him. Why? Because Donald Harvey was smart. He was careful. He didn't kill everyone on his shift. That would raise red flags. He spaced out the deaths over weeks or months. He targeted patients who were already sick, so their deaths seemed inevitable. He falsified medical charts when needed. Harvey later bragged that he was too good to get caught. He said he knew exactly how much poison would be lethal, but still look natural. He understood hospital procedures well enough to cover his tracks. One of his methods was particularly insidious. Harvey would sometimes inject small, non-lethal doses of poison over several days, making patients progressively sicker until they died of what appeared to be organ failure or infection. Slow murder. Deliberate. Calculated. In 1985, Harvey left the VA hospital voluntarily. He wasn't caught. He wasn't suspected. He simply wanted a change of scenery. He moved to Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital, working briefly in the pediatric unit. Thankfully, there's no evidence Harvey killed any children there, but the fact that he had access to them is absolutely chilling. Within a year, he transferred again, this time to Drake Memorial Hospital's main campus. This would be his final workplace, and his deadliest. At Drake Memorial Hospital, Donald Harvey reached the peak of his murderous career. By 1986, he wasn't just a nurse's aide. He also worked part-time in the hospital morgue and autopsy room. Think about that. He had access to living patients and dead bodies. He had access to chemicals, medical equipment, and complete privacy. This is when Harvey's killing went into overdrive. He later confessed that during his time at Drake Memorial, he was killing 2 to 3 people per month. The bodies just kept piling up, and hospital staff simply assumed it was a bad year for patient outcomes. Harvey's methods became more varied and creative. He'd inject cyanide into IV bags. He'd contaminate food with arsenic. He'd inject air bubbles into patients' bloodstreams to cause fatal embolisms. He even admitted to deliberately infecting patients with hepatitis and HIV-contaminated blood. But here's where Harvey's story takes an even darker turn. His victims were no longer limited to hospital patients. Harvey started killing people in his personal life. He poisoned his neighbor because the man's motorcycle was too loud and annoyed him. He fed his neighbor arsenic-laced food over several weeks until the man became violently ill and died. He killed his boyfriend's ex-partner by putting cyanide in his drink at a social gathering. He even tried to poison his own boyfriend, Carl Hueller, multiple times, though his boyfriend survived because Harvey used smaller doses, possibly because he actually had some twisted affection for him. When asked later why he killed people who weren't even sick, Harvey shrugged and said, "They annoyed me, or I just felt like it." One of his most disturbing victims was John Powell, a 44-year-old man who'd been on life support for months after a motorcycle accident. Powell had actually started to recover and showed signs of improvement, but Donald Harvey decided Powell should die. Why? Harvey later claimed he felt sorry for Powell and wanted to end his suffering, but Powell was getting better. The truth is, Harvey probably just felt like killing that day. Harvey laced Powell's feeding tube with cyanide. Powell went into cardiac arrest and died within hours. It was this murder that would finally bring Harvey down. March 1987. John Powell's sudden death troubled his doctor. Powell had been recovering perfectly. His vital signs were strong. There was no medical explanation for his sudden cardiac arrest. The doctor made a decision that would change everything. He ordered a complete autopsy and comprehensive toxicology screening. The results came back days later. Massive amounts of cyanide in Powell's system. Hospital administrators were stunned. They immediately launched an internal investigation, reviewing all recent unexpected deaths at Drake Memorial. And they found a pattern. An alarming number of sudden, unexplained deaths had occurred during shifts worked by one particular employee, Donald Harvey. On March 31, 1987, police and hospital security confronted Harvey at work. They brought him to a small office and questioned him about John Powell's death. Harvey initially denied everything. He played the concerned, shocked employee. How could this happen? Cyanide? That's impossible. But the investigators had evidence. They told Harvey they were exhuming bodies, testing other victims. The net was closing, and then Harvey's mask dropped. "Okay," he said calmly. "I'll tell you everything." What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. Harvey didn't confess to one murder. He didn't confess to a handful. Over the next several hours, Donald Harvey calmly, methodically described killing after killing after killing. He drew diagrams showing investigators where he hid poison in his locker and at home. He explained exactly how he administered lethal doses. He walked detectives through his methods: the pillow smothering, the cyanide injections, the arsenic in food. He named victims, like he was reading a shopping list. First names, last names, approximate dates. The detectives were horrified. Some had to leave the room. One investigator later said it was like listening to someone describe swatting flies. Completely emotionless, completely casual. Harvey confessed to 87 murders, but then he added something that made everyone's blood run cold. "There are more, a lot more. I lost count after a while, maybe 300, maybe more than that. I honestly don't remember them all. When police searched Donald Harvey's apartment, they found a house of horrors. Hidden in his bedroom closet, bottles of cyanide and arsenic, carefully labeled and stored. In his nightstand, medical supplies stolen from hospitals over the years. Syringes, IV tubing, medication vials. On his bookshelf, textbooks on poisons, toxicology, and pharmacology, with passages underlined and notes in the margins. But the most disturbing discoveries were the trophies. Boxes and boxes of personal items taken from victims. Jewelry, watches, photographs, religious medals, wedding rings. Harvey had kept them all, stored in his bedroom like a collection. Investigators also found journals. Harvey had kept written records of some of his murders, describing in clinical detail how victims reacted to different poisons, how long they took to die, whether they suffered or went peacefully. He wrote about murder the way a scientist writes about experiments. One journal entry, describing a patient he poisoned with cyanide, read, "Subject showed symptoms within 8 minutes. Cardiac distress at 12 minutes. Death at 19 minutes. Very effective. Would use again. No remorse, no emotion, just data." Donald Harvey's trial began in August 1987 in Cincinnati. He was charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder. Facing overwhelming evidence and his own confession, Harvey's attorneys negotiated a plea deal. Harvey would plead guilty to avoid the death penalty and receive multiple life sentences instead. In court, Harvey showed no emotion as the charges were read. Families of victims filled the courtroom, many weeping, some screaming at him. Harvey stared straight ahead, expressionless. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in Ohio, plus 20 years. Later, Kentucky charged him with 9 additional murders, and he received more life sentences there. In total, Harvey was officially convicted of 37 murders, though he'd confessed to 87. But the question haunted everyone: why? Harvey's explanations changed constantly depending on his audience. To some interviewers, he portrayed himself as a mercy killer, an angel of death ending the suffering of terminally ill patients. But investigators proved that most of his victims weren't terminally ill. Many were recovering. Some were perfectly healthy people he poisoned outside the hospital. To other interviewers, Harvey admitted he killed because patients annoyed him. They complained too much. They were demanding. They were rude. So he decided they should die. Sometimes Harvey claimed he killed for power, that playing God over life and death gave him a thrill. Nothing else could match. And sometimes he simply said, "It felt good. It made me feel better about myself." Court-appointed psychologists diagnosed Harvey as a psychopath with severe antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic traits, and possible sadistic tendencies. He showed absolutely no genuine remorse for any of his crimes. In one particularly chilling interview, a reporter asked Harvey if he felt bad about the people he killed. Harvey thought for a moment, then shrugged. "They were all going to die eventually anyway. I just moved the schedule up a little." "What's the difference?" the reporter pressed. "But some of them would have lived for years. You took that from them." Harvey smiled slightly. "And some of them would have suffered for years. Maybe I did them a favor." This is the logic of a man completely disconnected from empathy, from humanity itself. Donald Harvey spent nearly 30 years in prison, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, a maximum security institution. Even behind bars, Harvey remained manipulative. He gave interviews, wrote letters to journalists, and continued to hint that his victim count was far higher than what he confessed to. He seemed to enjoy the attention his notoriety brought. He liked being known as one of America's most prolific serial killers. But in prison, Harvey wasn't a celebrity. To other inmates, he was a baby killer and a poisoner, 2 of the lowest categories in the prison hierarchy, despised even by other criminals. On March 28, 2017, Donald Harvey was found beaten to death in his cell. He was 64 years old. Another inmate had attacked him with a homemade weapon, beating him so severely that Harvey died from his injuries 2 days later. Prison officials never fully explained the motive, but many believe it was a targeted hit, that someone in the prison decided Harvey deserved to die for his crimes. Ironically, Donald Harvey, who'd killed so many people in hospital beds, died violently in a prison cell. When news of his death broke, reactions were mixed. Some families of victims said they were glad he was gone. Others said they wished he'd lived longer to suffer more. One victim's daughter said, "I'm not happy he's dead. I'm angry it took this long. He should have been executed decades ago." Donald Harvey's killing spree exposed massive failures in the American healthcare system. How did one man kill 87+ people over 18 years without being caught? The answer is disturbing. Hospitals failed to notice suspicious patterns, failed to investigate unexpected deaths, and failed to properly screen employees. Harvey had no medical training when he was first hired. His background checks were minimal. Even when he was fired from one hospital for theft, he easily got hired at another hospital with no one checking his employment history. After Harvey's arrest, hospitals across the country implemented new protocols, stricter background checks for healthcare workers, better tracking of medication and controlled substances, mandatory reporting of suspicious patient deaths, regular audits of patient mortality rates by unit and shift. But here's the terrifying truth. We'll never know Harvey's true victim count. He confessed to 87, he was convicted of 37, but he consistently claimed the real number was over 300, maybe more. Investigators who reviewed hospital death records from Harvey's employment periods found hundreds of suspicious deaths that could potentially be linked to him. But with bodies cremated or buried decades ago, there's no way to test for poison. Families who lost loved ones during Harvey's years at various hospitals live with a horrible uncertainty. Was my father murdered? My grandmother? My spouse? They'll never know for sure. Donald Harvey called himself an angel of death, but there was nothing angelic about him. He was a predator who found vulnerable victims in hospital beds and decided he had the right to end their lives. He was a narcissist who enjoyed the power of playing God, of deciding who lived and who died. He was a psychopath who felt no remorse, no empathy, no humanity. For 18 years, he walked hospital hallways, trusted by everyone, killing with impunity. Families thanked him for his kindness as their loved ones died in front of them, never knowing he was the killer. Patients smiled at him, grateful for his gentle care, never knowing he just poisoned their IV. Doctors praised his dedication, never knowing he was murdering their patients. Donald Harvey is dead now, beaten to death in prison by another inmate. Some call it justice, some call it karma. But for the families of his victims, the confirmed 37, the confessed 87, or the possible 300 plus, there's no real justice. Their loved ones are still gone, and they died at the hands of a man who claimed he was helping them. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like Donald Harvey, soft-spoken, friendly, with a gentle smile. And that's what makes them truly terrifying. Hit subscribe to Scream Index. Explore the darkest corners of human nature, if you dare.